Okay, guys, what I've done here is I've broken this down into three sections. Okay, so what we're looking at today is the history, the background of psychotherapy in general, and yeah, because it was so information heavy. I decided to do it this way. I thought, right, this will be a bit easier. And also to break it down into these three sections. So the first section is on the evolution of consciousness and spirituality. Second section is going to be on the history of like the timeline and the various happenings. And then the third section, I've entitled it Two Therapies. So you'll see where that goes when we get to it. Now, the biggest block is the middle bit, dealing with the actual development, the history part of psychotherapy. That's going to be the heaviest or the most. That's where most of the information is, I suppose, in terms of detail. But this section here is really, really, really important because it sets the stage, if you like, of the development and what it is. I think it does anyway. So that's what I've done. Um, there's each of the three sections. We're going to be using these sort of PowerPoint um, or keynote slides. So just to make it a bit easier now, because this is not process driven, it's information. Just stop me and stick your hand up, or if you've any questions or anything at all, just feel free to jump in, and we can pause it and look at whatever that point is. Uh, as we go on. Now, I haven't run these through in terms of time, so I'm guessing that we'll have sufficient time for stops and stuff. But sure, we'll see how we get on as we do it. Okay, so this piece, the evolution of consciousness and spirituality, this is taken from a guy's work called Morris Berman. Now, Morris Berman, he who is he? He's an academic. He's a scholar. He's an American guy. He's a writer. He wrote a book called Coming to Your Senses, and he's on YouTube. He was born in 1944. He's still alive. He's a really, really well informed bloke, and he's worthwhile researching. Basically, it's definitely worthwhile reading any of his stuff. Now, his stuff is not just confined to the area of psychological growth, but it is very psychological in nature. And I suppose I'd recommend him. He's used a lot in a lot of the courses over here, his teachings and writings. So he's very well grounded. So basically, he frames this. He's where are we starting from? Well, we're starting from the upper Paleolithic. That's where we're going back to, which is this section here, about between 11,000 years ago and 50,000 years ago. This is where general agreement is that. Sorry, can I enlarge it? Yeah, I'm sure I can. Hang on, how do I do this? Yeah, okay, let me see.
That's better. Thanks.
Bit more.
No, big more. Okay.
Thank you.
Can you see it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's this bit here, the upper paleo, can't even say Paleolithic, between 50,000 and 11,000 years ago. So there's general agreement that the emergence of self-consciousness and awareness happened around 35,000 years ago. So what were we doing then? We were coming out of the Stone Age. We were very much doing this type of thing. And during this time, obviously cave painting started to happen. There was evidence of carving, of polishing. We started building tools and repairing them. a sharp increase in artifacts, for people jumping down into caves and stuff like that. We see that there was artistic and symbolic representations beginning to happen. So we can also see that during this period, we start to become goal orientated. So there was planning, there was strategies were beginning to happen. And all in all, you could say this indicates a movement from exterior to mind. So the development of self-consciousness and awareness was happening. We were becoming more informed from within and less involved with the exterior, if you like, as us. So this period in time, look at the picture, amazing. All the hands, gosh, you can imagine what must have been going on for the person doing that. Or down here, what exactly was trying to be, the representation, what was happening? It's quite incredible when you look at these things through these eyes. I think it is, anyway. This image here, we have a lot of, in Ireland, we have a lot of images of the Earth Mother in a more sort of graphic pose than that. The Sheila, we call them Sheila and the gigs, where you really, it's a symbol of fertility and I suppose the bountifulness of nature, of diversity. But anyway, this is where it was all beginning. So this generates, all of this generates a very powerful and alienating split between self and world. So I am now separate from the world. I'm thinking for myself, and I am planning on how I can get what I want and what I need from the world as other. So it's the same split that occurs with self-consciousness in the infant at around 2 or 3 years old, where the infant is leaving behind the unity of mother world, where self-consciousness is emerging within our own self. And we all went through this stage. So let's just move it to this one now. So we enter into what might be termed as the gap. Now, Berman calls this paradoxical consciousness. We'll come to it in a moment. But we have the real. We have what's real around us. So these images in the caves, guys chasing animals with spears and all that sort of stuff, that's the real world. And then we have the imaginary, which is a world of our own creation. And then to bridge our imaginary, our thinking world and the real world, we start to develop these symbols. Sorry, I'm not used to this, so I'm getting rid of all these little messages. So we have this symbolic. So we can trace it back to this time anyway. Now, this movement from exterior to mind, this generation of self-consciousness, the gap between when we were part of the forest and as we begin to stand up into self-consciousness, exactly the same as 2 or 3 years old. And you hear the phrase the pain of ego consciousness, the pain of carrying our own ego. And even you know, as the terms as we stand up, finding our feet, we're leaving something else behind. So this is what Lacan later on, as you'll see in the next presentation, this is what Lacan calls the gap. Or there was another guy, Belint, and he called it the basic fault. The gap or the basic fault. And it's really a place where we entered into imagination, where we had to, where we stood in nothing. We had left behind what was real, and we were moving into a new position, conscious position, and there was nothing there for us. It wasn't filled full of anything. It was empty. We didn't know who. We don't know who we are. We're stepping away from the mothership, and we don't know who we are. We're stepping into the unknown, into the imaginary. So is it going to be wonderful? Is it going to be terrible? Is it going to be what? I don't really know. So we have these sort of opposites start coming into play, where suddenly we're waking up to something, and it's going to fall into somewhere between these two opposites. So this is really the beginning of self-awareness. And then, you know, later on, we have somebody like Jung coming along. This is how our imagination was projected into the gap, or came out of the gap, where we needed something to stabilize us. You know, what we were leaving behind was this innate experience of God, of the divine. And what we're stepping into is self-consciousness, which has no God in it. So, you know, we need to create a God. We need to create the outside of the bubble. We need to have limits. We need to have security and know, you know, the extent of safety. So we create a God. And the God image evolves in the symbolic, in the imaginary. So Jung says, whoever knows God, whoever knows God, God has an effect on him. So for the individual, knowing God is a process of recognizing and assimilating the pressured and paradoxical contents of the self, which come to consciousness, which come to consciousness or seek incarnation from within the ego. So out of the gap, out of our imagination, the God of our own self-creation arises. Out of this gap. And before we create the God, we are floating around basically with nothing. We've left Mother, I suppose, a simultaneous arising, but you know, out of the tension of nothingness comes God. So this would have been moving us forward towards the Neolithic, I suppose. Let's see. Yeah, this is a pulling away from the primal unity with Mother and world as we become aware of self as a separate entity within a world of others. This is a pulling away from the primal unity with Mother and world as we become aware of self as a separate entity within a world of others. So Berman says that we lived within, our Paleolithic ancestors lived within a state of paradoxical consciousness. Paradoxical consciousness, being focused and unfocused, hovering, attentive, waiting, peripheral perception, horizontal. So God, the God of the forest, is suddenly not as known anymore. We're no longer running with the animals. Now we're chasing the animals. Do you see? We're no longer living in the trees. Now we're chopping the trees down to use them for our purpose. So rather than the intense or the ecstatic, accepting the world that it is, including this, how can I say it? I say that now. Let's see. Yeah. So this paradoxical consciousness, where we were once accepting the world as it is, now we have to include the split between self and world. This is part of our experience. So we are both part of the forest, and we are also separate from the forest. So we're hovering, as he says, we're in this state of waiting, or neither on the ground nor we're no longer standing on the ground. Now we're sort of hovering above the ground, if you like, and we have this. We're looking out. We're sort of looking out of the gap, out of the nothingness. We haven't completed our full creation of what we are. The ego is in its beginnings, so 2.5 years old, and we're standing up, and we're starting to look around us, wondering what's this and what's that. We're starting to explore, if you like. So within the earlier state, the spirit wasn't separate. It was very much part of the forest. It was eminent within the world. It was everywhere in everything. So the smell of the forest after the rain, the colors from the dewdrops, the way the rustle of the leaves, the sound of leaves rustling in the wind, and the changing color of the seasons. The secular is the sacred. It wasn't coming from inside, it was coming from all around us. And in the same way, mother and world is the secular. That's all we know until we begin to develop ego consciousness. So this brings us up to around the Neolithic era. So the Neolithic era, just going back to this one, about, from 10,000 years forward, getting into more modern times, where we begin to establish colonies. We start to settle down. We leave behind the whole hunter-gatherer thing, and we start to move more towards agriculture and community. It's the beginning of agriculture about 10,000 years ago. And this, Berman says, this is where consciousness really began to change. In becoming sedentary, in settling down, we shift from a direct experience of life to a pursuit of substitutes. We shift from a direct experience of life to a pursuit of substitutes. So the direct experience was, eating when I'm hungry, and the food, the deer pops out of the forest when we're looking for it. We're in a direct contact. Everything is synchronistic. The God is everywhere. Whereas now, the God is at the end of the harvest. We're planting seeds in the ground, and we're sort of saying, okay, well, we have to wait now for these seeds to grow. So in becoming sedentary, we shift from a direct experience of life to a pursuit of substitutes. Within this delayed return economy, with its inherent insecurity, trust in the world declines, and a fear of death begins to take a prominent place. Death becomes a very real alternative. You know, if I lose my tools, you know, or if I break my leg, or if I, you know, if the grain goes moldy, well, you know, what's going to happen to me and mine? So hunter-gatherers, the previous type of experience, hunter-gatherers, they dealt with their insecurity by splitting or fusing. So if there was a problem within the group, then the group would divide, or it would fuse with another group and would continue. So we had this splitting and fusing type of process, and that was how problems were resolved. Whereas in these more sedentary communities, settled communities, we created rules to deal with problems and conflicts. We didn't split and fuse. You know, crops are in the ground, so you can't split and run away. So rules and authority structures were developed, and this is he's talking about consciousness beginning to change. Well, this is how it went. This is one of the ways in which it began to change. We created hierarchical structures, authority structures, vertical power structures. So now the God is at the top. To see we had somebody who was in charge of the village, and they were more powerful than the people underneath them. So all of these sort of power dynamics began to emerge. Settled communities created rules and authority structures, i.e. vertical power structures. I just threw that in because it seemed very appropriate. So the sacred, which was formerly located in nature, you know, in the forest, in the wood, in the world, is now projected upwards. So the ego is projecting the God into the world of ego. We are now leaving the natural world behind. So Berman calls this a moving towards the ascent model of spirituality, where the ruler king is God, like Pharaoh, you know, in Egypt, or in the Aztecs, where you know, the guy in charge basically has the power of God. He's the man on earth. He says it as it is. And paradox then is replaced with certainty. Paradox then gets replaced with certainty via these power structures. We know where we stand. So the vertical power relations, this sort of projection upwards, the want to climb the ladder and become the God for ourselves, becomes very, very powerful, because the higher up we are, the more certain we can be. And it's all running away from death, the gap, which if we enter into, brings us back to the real. What is real? So death becomes the doorway to what we left behind. Death behind us, God in front of us. Climb the ladder. So this we are slaves only to our ego consciousness as long as we continue to remain ignorant, unaware of how it functions inside us and the controlling hold it has. So from 2000 BC until recent times, this verticality, to be careful when I say that, verticality becomes more visible in our societies, in our communities. And the corresponding ecstatic experience, generates a psychological security healing the split. The corresponding ecstatic experience generates a psychological security healing the split with the natural world, with the natural God as secular, spirit in the forest. So this leads us more all of this offsets the pain of ego consciousness by means of a mystical experience that merges the psyche with the rest of creation. So as we move into this ascent model and we start climbing the ladder, we're moving more towards ecstatic experience, where the mystical experience, the blissful state, is where we merge the psyche with the rest of creation. And Freud calls this the oceanic experience. He sees it as regressive, whereas Jung sees it as progressive, in that meeting with the soul, becoming individuated, the self relationship, capital S, small s, opening up this self relationship, the ego self relationship, the ego self axis. So in one sense, it's a return to primitive wisdom through the ecstatic experience. That would be Jung's version. The collective wisdom or the primitive wisdom. And in another sense, it's tranced out. It's falling into the gap, a regressive move back to the oceanic experience. Freud talks about back to unconsciousness, into a state of entrancement. And then according to Freud, the oceanic feeling is a regression to an infinite feeling of unity within the external world, is a regression to an infantile feeling. So back to when I was 1.5, 1, 2, within the external world. The true source of religion is not the oceanic feeling, but an infinite feeling of helplessness, which can be traced to the child's need for the father projection. The true source of religion is not this oceanic feeling, but an infantile feeling of helplessness, which can be traced to the child's need for the father projection. And then in 1931, when there was a lot of splits happening, this writing was being challenged. So, any questions so far? Does it make sense? Can you see how the development is moving from a very early primitive hunter-gatherer type existence into a more sedentary, settled communities, and how the transfer of one to the other, the sacred is transferred from the horizontal into the vertical, via these power structures, accompanying power structures. You know, the priest standing at the front of the church, being the God's voice on earth, basically. So, apart from the mystical ascent out of our body, we now channel erotic energy into specific experiences and regard it as the norm. So this leaving behind of the forest is also leaving behind of the aliveness of our bodies. And we're moving more into the imaginary as we cross the gap, as we leave the real behind and cross the gap and enter into a world of our projected imagination. You know, McVitie's at the front. I don't know if you have McVitie biscuits in Denmark, but there was a series of ads. Yeah. Okay. So this God in front of us, God above us, this projection of the sacred out of us, and then something that we must chase after, you know, to have power, to give us certainty, to take away the pain of this separation. Yes?
So would you say that if you have
Hang on, I need to adjust my volume. Okay, go again.
You say that if you have a troubled childhood, you will be more probably would be more probably like to be religious because you need the feeling of helplessness, which can be traced to the child's need of a father protection.
Yeah, well, Jung said that his work was all about an approach to the sacred. So when trauma arises, we become helpless. We move backwards. You know, we regress. So yes, I would say is the answer to what you're saying. We move back and we become helpless. And in a way, what Freud is saying that is that our helplessness is our closest position to the God. So within helplessness, we are back with Mother. Mother being the powerful one. You know, Mother God, Mother World, Mother Nature. So this experience of helplessness, the oceanic experience that Freud talks about as a regressive quality, how do we manifest it in the world? Well, you know, we fall off the ladder. You know, we fall into unconsciousness. So this unconsciousness is not just at the bottom; it's also part of culture. It's in the tranced out. It's in the unconscious position of now, as much as down at the bottom of the ladder. Apart from the mystical ascent out of our body, we now channel erotic energy into specific experiences. So this projection of Mother, the erotic libido that bonds us with Mother, that excites us into the forest, that places us into the aliveness of the world, the aliveness within ourself, the erotic within the erotic energy. This feeling within our libido of aliveness, it's projected out, body dead, you know, experience alive, and we move into the specific experiences looking for this aliveness. We no longer source it from within ourselves. We now look for it outside of ourselves. So it's projected out into experiences like romantic love. It's like, oh my God. Romantic love is what? Or heroism, being a hero. Again, the drive, the feeling towards wanting to be that. It's It's like the feeling of great ambition, the feeling to improve, to climb the ladder, to achieve, to hold that position. It all becomes it's part of this unconscious projection, which is coming out of the split, our need to be anything more than we are. You know, jumping way ahead, Fritz Perls says what a lot of people try to do is self-actualize their self-image. Self-actualizing your self-image rather than the real self. So this wanting to be something else than I am, a movement out of my body, a leaving the ground behind. The ground of my being is being left behind. I want to be like him. I want to be a pilot. Do you know, I'm projecting energy into the imaginary position of pilot. It's an erotic energy. It's alive. It's exciting. It's this sort of mystical experience. It represents the high. You know, stick the needle in my arm. Tell me I'm going to be a pilot. Yay! There I go. You see, now I'm back up there again. So Jung sees this movement as progressive in connecting with the wisdom within ourselves, coming back to the numinous, coming back to the erotic nature of life. And the way Jung approaches it is by differentiating it, by developing the ability to see it. So we're not going back unconsciously looking at the oceanic experience. We're entering into it now, standing up tall, strong, and steady, with clear minds, with open eyes. You see, and in that way, we're bringing awareness to the God within us. So it's a totally different position than psychoanalytic work, which is looking more at the structure. Jung is looking more at the development or the evolution of consciousness in this way. So industrial society. Let's see, where are we? Number 10. Okay, we go to number 11. So here we go. Central to Jungian psychology is the concept of individuation, the process whereby a person discovers and evolves his self as opposed to his ego. The ego is the persona, the mask created and demanded by everyday social interaction, and as such it constitutes the center of our conscious life, our understanding of ourselves through the eyes of others. The self, on the other hand, is our true center, our awareness of ourselves without outside interference. It is developed by bringing the conscious and unconscious parts of our mind into harmony. So that's by Morris Berman. So central to Jungian psychology is the concept of individuation, the process whereby a person discovers and evolves his self as opposed to his ego. The ego is a persona, a mask, created and demanded by everyday social interaction. So Fritz Perls said, people want to self-actualize their self-image. The beginning point, to see the bottom of the ladder. People want to they don't realize this split, they don't realize the gap, they don't realize the separation between mind and body because they've split. They're not aware of the ground, they're not aware of spirit in the secular. And all they are aware of is this projection of the erotic libido out into the world, into an imaginary sense of being. And they fall in love with that. They want to self-actualize the self-image rather than the real self. So within industrial society, coming right up to time, as it were, within industrial society, Berman has coined the phrase Dullardism. Dullardism. And it sort of ties in. I don't know whether this program or this cartoon was born out of Berman's work or whether he just used it, but they both happen at around the same time. Berman states the current way of dealing with ego consciousness is Dullardism. So we've all gone asleep. We're all dull and boring. We're all wearing grey. I.e., spacing out with a short-term high. You know, God is in the moments of aliveness. You know, again, the ascent model of spirituality, our favorite addiction. You know, TV program or the internet or work or a person, you know, an activity. And he suggests that those who try to inspire today's culture do so through a return to the ascent model. That even the leaders, those who try to inspire, those who are trying to lead the way forward, are doing so through the same model, the same form of consciousness as has been going on since the Neolithic times. We're all going in the wrong direction. We're all moving away from the body nature, that we're still doing the same thing. We're looking for drugs and we're looking for mystical experiences and we're looking for blissed out states of consciousness, all up at the top, all ahead of us. You know, meditate myself into a high, become more unconscious to the body split. You know, God at the bottom, God in the ordinary. And that this is a serious problem. This is the problem of our time. And he sort of advises caution, Berman. He advises caution towards transpersonal spirituality as being, you know, a great place to go unconscious, a wonderful place to leave the body completely behind and live in a cloud. And he goes as far as saying that we have lost our spiritual intelligence, that we have become completely, we've turned into a race of dullards. It's wonderful, isn't it? So here we go again, Mr. Berman.
Could you read it
Real
out
goal. Sorry?
You read every time there comes that quote, you then read it out loud.
Oh yeah, okay. The real goal of a spiritual tradition should not be ascent, but openness. The real goal of a spiritual tradition should not be ascent, but openness, vulnerability. And this does not require great experiences, but, on the contrary, very ordinary ones. Charisma is easy. Presence, self-remembering, is terribly difficult, and where the real work lies. I'll read it again. The real goal of a spiritual tradition should not be ascent, but openness and vulnerability. This does not require great experiences, but on the contrary, very ordinary ones. Charisma is easy. Presence and self-remembering is terribly difficult, and that's where the real work lies. So Berman's claim is that our addiction, you know, our mass addiction, our collective addiction, is to this vertical model, is to these paradigm shifts in consciousness, highs, excitement, and the corresponding denial of our somatic experience. In order to have the high, we have to depress the ordinariness of the body. We move into an excited place, and in so doing, we're leaving the body behind. He says the addiction is rooted in the denial of the somatic experience. The addiction is rooted in the denial of the somatic experience. And he states that we need a renewal of our corporeality. We need a renewal of our own corporality that plays down any ascent. So we need to be working on being embodied. The journey is downwards, not upwards. We need to work on, in fact, the journey is not even downwards. The journey is back inwards, because downwards is another paradigm shift. The journey is back into ourselves, back into the mundane, boring, ordinary me that I am. Do you see? And to become aware, become alive within my own commonality. I am the same as others. So he says that the need for certainty, which comes out of sedentary life, the need for certainty overlies a deeper need for the world to be unpredictable, surprising, and alive. Our need for certainty overlies a deeper need. The deeper need is that the world needs to be unpredictable, surprising, and alive. You know, so going out into the garden and allowing yourself to be surprised and experience the aliveness and the unpredictability, you know, being amazed at the rain. Somebody have their hand up. Are you okay? No questions. Okay. So that is what Berman is saying now. He says the split between self and world has been lost. It's been buried. The split between self and world, it's been left behind. We've developed cities and we've built buildings and cathedrals, and we've moved on, and the split between self and world has been lost, and it needs mending. So religion and attachment has arisen due to a lack of paradoxical thinking. Religion and attachment, this desire, this projected erotic energy. I want a new fishing rod. I want a new, I need to go on a holiday, a bigger holiday, a better holiday, whatever it is. I want my partner to be more in love with me. This projection of desire, and also the projection of the imaginary. Religion, the projection of the imaginary, taking God out of the forest, taking God out of the everywhere, out of the body, and projecting God up on top of a mountain somewhere, and creating a religion. All of this has arisen due to a lack of this paradoxical thinking. I am me, and I am also part of this. I am me, I am a self, and I'm also part of the forest. The moving downwards back into herself. He says, happens when we take our mind off things. Literally, when we take our mind off things. And movement, physical movement, being such an immediate experience, does away with the need for religion. How about that? You don't upset the world. That physical movement, when you move your body, that the somatic experience, the immediacy of that experience, does away with the need for any religion. It brings you right back to God. And he says religion is a response to our anxiety. Our anxiety of being separated from this unity, primal mother spirit is in the secular right now experience. That God is the immediacy of the here and now. He says religion, the creation of religion, this projection of spirituality into the ascent model, God in front, us behind, is a response to anxiety. So movement is the catharsis of that anxiety. When we come back to the body and we begin to experience our body self and come back to the somatic experience, we leave the ascent model behind and we enter back into God as secular, God as the here and now, and that movement becomes a catharsis of that stuck aliveness, that blocked aliveness that we're searching for, which removes the need for religion, which is the ascent model of spirituality. So people who kneel down and start putting their hands up in the air praying to God, maybe what they need to do is go for a walk in the park. And maybe what the client needs to do is get up off the chair and go over and roll around on the ground in the corner for a few minutes, and then go back into the chair and say, well, what was that like? Do you see? Bring the person back out of this empty place, this projected oceanic experience, helpless position, and bring them back into their own aliveness. So following on from his statements on religion, then he goes on to say pilgrimage. You know, we all have felt the need at some stage to go on a pilgrimage of sorts. If you look at it as the movement between holy sites rather than the destination at the holy site, the act of pilgrimage is the movement that happens between the holy sites. It's in the journey rather than the destination. It's within the journey rather than the destination. And he more or less ends this particular sort of teaching, if you like, on a suggestion of qualities, that the qualities we're actually looking for is silence, embodiment, genuineness, delight, and wonder. Silence, embodiment, genuineness, delight, and wonder. Now, it'll be interesting to compare those later on with the core qualities that Roger talks about Carl Rogers. But silence, embodiment, genuineness, delight and wonder to be found in our commonality and ordinariness. So that's that's the evolution of human consciousness as given by Morris Berman. And he has many, many books, and he's a well-published, there's quite a lot of them up on YouTube for those of you who are interested enough to follow on and have a look. He talks about many, many different subjects, talks a lot about politics of our current era and how America is doomed to fail and stuff like that. So it's quite topical. I think he was born in 1944, so that would make him what? He'd be in his 80s, 70s, 80s, or I'm fairly sure he's still alive. So guys, how do you feel about that? What happens?
On which part?
Well, just coming back to the big screen. About any part, what bit hits you from that presentation? The evolution of human consciousness and spirituality. You surprised? No? Are any of you a bit shocked by anything you've heard?
A while back, I read a book called Homo Sapiens.
Yeah.
More or less says in a different way, but it's the same. And back then, it's about a year and a half ago, and there it was kind of an awakening for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and it's nice to hear it again.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're dead right. This is not just Burma that teaches this. This is general knowledge. This is as it is. Sorry, excuse me. I thought his phrase, the split between self and world has been lost. It needs mending. I thought that was a really interesting comment because he's talking about our own ego development, the split between mother and self and mother, the emergence of ego consciousness within ourselves, which happened when we were 2 or 3 years old. This very real experience needs looking at. This is the beginning of the ascent model within ourselves. This is where we stepped away from our own embodiment. We all have a mother. We all went through that cycle, that process of our first steps. And we've all been indoctrinated into a religious belief. Even if you say, well, I'm an atheist, your position as an atheist is in direct opposition to the religious position. So we are organized by current society and current societal thinking. So I thought, right, okay, well, I'm going to throw this piece in first before we get into the sort of whole development of the different schools of psychotherapy, because it provides good ground. It sort of shows, okay, this is where the initial wounding is. and you know, bringing in the idea of that gap, that one did not just seamlessly flow out of the other, that there is this sort of gap where we were paradoxically held in the middle. We were suspended in the middle. And did we successfully make it across the gap? I think it's a good image. Or is some of us still hanging in there somehow, suspended in the middle, not quite knowing which direction to go? Do you see, do we need to go back and rescue ourselves, part of ourselves, from that gap? Or have we shot off in some direction into our imagination of self, into our self-image? Is that what we're sort of building on? Are we not building at the center? Are we building somewhere around the edge, but not at the center? So listen, what I suggest is maybe we're an hour into this. So if you just want to take a few minutes just to stretch your legs, and then we'll come back and we'll start into the next bit. And we'll see how we get on. So maybe 2 or 3 minutes, not too long if you can. Just do a toilet stop. Just opening up.
It was a long toilet experience.
Say again?
Just said sorry for the delay. It was a long toilet experience.
Oh, that's okay. I'm glad. It sounds enjoyable, so we'll not go into it. Not too deeply anyway. Okay, so how do I do this? Share screen again. Yeah, okay. And press share. Well, okay, that should be working now. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So
Could you enlarge that as well to 100%? Thank you.
okay, I'm going to have to play with the size of this because some of the slides will have a bit of information on them, but however, we'll do it as we go along. So guys, this new section, completely different. I intend this section will, judging on the time of the last section, which is about right, I reckon this we'll go into lunchtime and we'll come back and we'll do an hour of the far side of lunch on this. And then the final section, I reckon possibly about 3/4 of an hour or so. So I'm sort of allocating about 2 hours, a little bit more for this section. Hopefully it'll all fit into that. Okay, so psychotherapy, it's such, you know, the information I'm going to give you now, it's a compilation of so many different sources, and you know, it's the information is available, you know, so there's nothing to stop you guys going off and researching it and doing your own sort of search into this. And because what I'm going to present here is more from a humanistic perspective, because that's the area, I suppose, that we're all training in, and you know, so it's coming from our particular position. But I mean, you could equally do this research from a psychoanalytical position, and you'd go down different routes and discover different things. However, I've tried to pull in what I think is a fairly broad enough perspective. Okay, so psychotherapy, the first real mention of it begins as an outgrowth of natural philosophy rather than as an outgrowth of medicine. So originally the work was done by romantic psychiatrists, as they're named. And the first guy in this sort of lineage, if you want to call it that, is Johann Heinroth, and in Leipzig, Germany, around the turn of the 1800s. There, he was appointed as professor of psychiatry, that's spelled wrong, and psychotherapy. So this is the first mention, really, of the word psychotherapy that I found. Now, originally, the work of the Romantic philosophers, they named mental disorder as mental rather than having a somatic base. So the areas of medicine would have been more sort of coming from everything has a somatic base. It's the body. So these Romantic philosophers, they were more naming mental disorders as mental, and that was a big difference. This guy was born in 1773, 1843. So he was appointed this position 1811. His approach basically was quite humanistic. It contained cognitive, behavioral, and conversational elements from records, utilizing the patient's mental powers of mind, mood, and will, and also featuring his own spirituality. So he was bringing quite a lot to the table. Papers written about his work include one notably called Between Theology and Psychiatry. So, very center stage. He was responsible for the introduction of the term psychosomatic into medical literature. And he believed that soul had primacy over the body. And so mental illness and somatic illnesses were caused by the soul. He believed that soul had primacy over the body. So mental illnesses and many other somatic illnesses were really, caused by the soul. So, you could say he had quite a holistic approach. And he was coming in, 80 years or so before Freud. So that's just where I chose to begin. So generally people would say that Freud is the father of psychoanalysis and modern day psychotherapy. And to a large extent he is, until you suddenly find, well, hang on, the work of natural philosophers goes back a lot further than Freud. And okay, Freud might have been the man that brought in certain ideas and created, gave it a direction. But there was stuff going on before Freud, no doubt. So, hang on, need to go back a slide. Yeah, okay. So this guy, Joseph Breuer, 1842 to 1925, there was when Freud came along around the turn of the century, there was a whole load of them in it. He wasn't on his own. And there was people, as I say, standing before him, and there's people who came into being afterwards. So he was part of an ongoing evolution. Now, he was a main mover, if you like. He was certainly a cornerstone for it. But Joseph Breuer, this fellow was an Austrian doctor working with a patient, and the patient's name is made famous with Freud under the name, the case of Anna O. But her real name, Bertha Pappenheim, she was a patient of Joseph Breuer, who I say was an Austrian doctor. And she was being treated for hysteria. You can see there in the slide, a young woman suffering from what was called hysteria. She had temporary paralysis, couldn't speak her native German, but could speak French and English. She couldn't drink water, even when thirsty. So Breuer was using hypnosis and the talking cure, as it was called then. and this greatly impacted Freud's career. So what basically happened was Freud never actually treated this person, but Breuer was treating her. And Freud went on to formulate certain ideas from the work with her that Breuer had shared. Breuer named the talking therapy work he was doing, which was happening on a daily basis with her. He named it with her as chimney sweeping. So this was his description of the work that was happening, that they were engaged in a form of chimney sweeping. And her story included dreams and experiences from her earlier life in caring primarily for her sick father, who subsequently passed away. But this was the body of the work where Freud was really stepping in and becoming interested. I might say that she made a good recovery through the work with Breuer as well. But she dreamt one important dream that arose was that she dreamt of a black snake approaching a sick person in a bed, and she felt paralyzed and unable to help. She dreamt of a black snake approaching a sick person in a bed, and she felt paralyzed and unable to help. So Freud concluded from this that her state of paralysis in real life was somehow linked to the state of anxiousness in the dream. And similarly with Breuer, earlier, rather in the work with Breuer, she recalled an earlier event from her childhood when her nanny's dog had drunk water from her glass, and she remembered the feeling of being repulsed by this. And Breuer attributed this traumatic experience to her inability to drink water, that she had formed an association between the negative event and her ability to drink water. So Breuer and Freud found that through bringing her unconscious anxiety into awareness, she began to recover. By bringing her unconscious anxiety into awareness, that she began to recover. And then this, of course, greatly influenced Freud's thinking and moved him to work through a more psychodynamic approach. So that case is known as Anna O. So Freud's observation of the Anna O case, in the very top there of that slide, there's just a quote I put in there from Freud. There's a mind and a brain. One is not accurately translatable into the workings of the other. There is a mind and a brain. One is not accurately translatable into the workings of the other. Okay, so some of Freud's observations from the Anna O case. And this very much became center stage in his development of his other theories, if you like. So unconscious drives manifest as symptomatic behaviors. Unconscious drives manifest as symptomatic behaviors. Now, this was quite cutting edge stuff back then. I mean, we take it for granted because we know it. But this guy was, working from the dark, you could say. Unconscious drives manifest as symptomatic behaviors. Even his discovery of drives was quite groundbreaking. So symptoms can substitute for remembering thoughts and feelings. Symptoms can substitute for remembering thoughts and feelings. So the symptoms that somebody develops in their body or their environment are a substitute. They're there instead of. It's another vehicle that the person has created for remembering certain thoughts and feelings. And symptoms are an attempt to heal psychic disturbance. Symptoms that somebody develops are an attempt to heal this psychic disturbance. And if symptoms are not produced, then psychopathological behavior may occur. So, that's an interesting one. If symptoms are not produced, then psychopathological behavior may occur. because it's putting the whole psychopathological behavior and the symptoms there, it's bringing them all together into one relationship. And, you know, if you want to work on the tablecloth, well, you can approach it from any one of the four corners. You know, so you can step into this person's process from any corner. So those 4 points, they would be very much center stage in Freud's ongoing development of theories. He also stated there, what a client doesn't remember will be repeated with the therapist. What a client doesn't remember will be repeated with the therapist, and that clients may unconsciously fear the removal of their symptoms and become resistant to change. And that is very noticeable as you work with clients. A client will come for a week, a session, a couple of sessions, and then suddenly become unavailable because they don't want to lose their symptoms. And there it is. Freud was talking about it way back then. So psychotherapy is an impossible profession. This is what Freud says. Psychotherapy is an impossible profession in which one can be sure beforehand of achieving unsatisfactory results. People don't want to get well. They come along and they tell you they want to get well, but they don't really want to get well. They want to self-actualize their own self-image. They don't go back to what's real in them. That would be, you know, taking away the symptoms. They don't want that. But that only emerges within the process. So basically, you know, if somebody walks out after the first session or tells you you're no use or anything like that, don't think twice about it. It's part of the process. You probably have done a very good job. And then around 1900 or so, 1901, 1899, depending on where you look, Freud published, well, in 1900, he published his book, Interpretation of Dreams, marking the beginning of psychoanalytical thought. That happened in 1900, his book, Interpretation of Dreams, and that marks the beginning of psychoanalytical thought. Shortly after this, he also introduced his theory on the Oedipal complex. Now, this is massive. So, you know, just as Jung talks about the archetype of the self as being the central organizing archetype, this Oedipal complex is the central organizing complex within our being. So this you know, working on this is working back at that sort of split, the beginning of ego consciousness that Berman was referring to. So the Oedipal complex, i.e. that from very young we repress feelings of love and hate. And you remember the other slide where love and hate was manifesting between the real and the imaginary, or the symbolic and the imaginary. That from very young we repress feelings of love and hate and a powerful, overwhelming libido drive towards parents and siblings. And repression of this creates what he called transferences. So when we repress this emotional energy within ourselves, it appears somewhere else. It is transferred into something else via a relationship with that person, thing, object. It appears as a transference. So Freud was able to see the connection between desire and taboo as well. Only that from which we deeply want, only that which we deeply want to do needs the prohibitive power of a taboo. Only that which we deeply want to do needs the prohibitive power of a taboo. In other words, people fear their wishes and desires, and paradoxically desire what they fear. So I was listening to a piece yesterday online about perversion. Wonderful dinner time viewing on YouTube, all about perversion. And it was coming from a psychoanalytical place. And one of the interesting things that was said in this fairly comprehensive video clip, which I didn't understand half of, was that the perversion is the outer manifestation of the inverted neurosis. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. That the neurosis appears and is held on the inside as an internal structure, and the perversion is the externalized aspect of that. And that perversion is not just sexual perversion. It can apply to any area of life. It's more like a distortion within the behavioral field. So it's worthwhile going online every so often and exploring, because you'll pick up little things like this and they'll just register inside you and sit there and then help you to make sense of something else. So so that was what I was doing yesterday. So a repression of these drives, repression of this emotional content within us becomes the basis of transferences. So transference or projection in a more sort of transference would be a lot more unconscious, whereas a projection is a lot more available, I suppose, to get at. Jung talks about projection of emotional content as being actual, that there is an actual transference of the emotional energy. And when you are projected upon, you have received a bundle. You are now more. There is an actual transfer. So within the area of transference, where it's really the creation of positions, the organizing of environment, all of this, where that which we repressed begins to manifest in therapy with the therapist. The transference is the whole field of organization, which leads to the surface, the felt experience, and the actualization of what the transference is containing. It's like setting the stage. It's the full, from the bottom up, organization of what happens, what breaks the surface. And I said this, and he said that, type of thing. So that is an enormous discovery from Freud. So then, let's see, do you want to say any more about that? So then during, that was 1900, or, the turn of the century with the Oedipal complex. And after that, an awful lot began to happen in lots of different directions. Freud had set up a psychoanalytical association, and a lot of the sort of in crowd, you could say, were part of that association. And he was very much the center stage on what was going on at the time. So during 1911, a few years after all of this, Alfred Adler left Freud's psychoanalytic group. And it was around this time, 1911, 1912, 1913, there must have been a major explosion, because so many people started to bail out. So many people start to leave this psychoanalytic group. Francis Adler, he left the group on the basis to form his own school of thought, and he claimed that he disagreed with Freud's emphasis on sexuality. So Freud was pushing this erotic, libido, sexual approach very strongly, and he wasn't going to be moved from it. Adler went on to form his own school of psychology individual. So the individual school of psychotherapy, if you want to call it that, or psychoanalysis. Adler was adamant that to understand a person, we must understand at internal as well as external. That understanding comes from internal and external factors. So you can see this wanting to branch out beginning to happen. His work being largely based on overcoming feelings of inferiority and weakness. So he was centering it around the inferior feeling, and then the drive to be superior. So his work was primarily based around that. And the work is very relevant today, depending on what you want to look at. So certain schools of psychotherapy, you could say, have specialized in certain directions. And even though at the beginning of the journey, certainly I didn't know an awful lot about this, but now I know a little bit more, and I can sort of look and say, well, that would be interesting to look into a certain drawer within myself. Maybe I'll find somebody who's studied in that school and work with them in an Algerian way. I don't know what it would be called, Algerian way. Anyway, the main difference between Freud and Adler, I'll just read them out. With Freud, behavior motivated by biological desires. So Freud was very much sex and aggression. Behavior is motivated by these biological drives. Whereas Adler was saying behavior was motivated more by social influence and striving. Biological drives versus social influence and striving. With Freud, there was no choice in the shaping of the personality. The shaping of the personality was coming directly from within. Whereas with Adler, people are responsible for who they are. People are responsible for who they are. With Freud, present behavior is from the past. That's it. And with Adler, present behavior is from the future. Present behavior is organized from the future. By what your need is for the future. With Freud, emphasis on unconscious process. With Adler, people are aware of what they do and why. Freud, I'll say it again, emphasis completely on unconscious process, whereas Adler, we're saying people are aware of what they do and why. And with Freud, it was the id, the ego, and the superego. And with Adler, it was more to do with holism. So you can imagine back 1911, 1910, 1909, these discussions were taking place within this analytical group. So this group, Freud's analytical group, was very much the kitchen where all these ingredients were being taken out and added in various different mixes, forming different flavors. And Freud was sitting very much center stage, saying what could and what shouldn't be agreed upon. And a lot of the people who sort of bounce out of Freud's group do so because of Freud's resistance, his unwillingness to go beyond his own thinking. So you could say Freud's theories are the birthplace of psychoanalysis, but also Freud's stubbornness has brought a great deal to bear on this as well. And in 1913, another person to leave was Carl Jung to develop his own ideas. He disagreed with many points with Freud, not just on the collective unconscious, but also on religion and spirituality. And Jung then went on to form the analytical group, analytical psychology. So that was another big, painful split, 1913. And also in 1913, you had a guy called Jacob Moreno, a Romanian-American psychiatrist, psychosocialist, and educator, born in 1989 and died in 1974. He was coming on stage and he emphasized spontaneity, interaction, and he went on to develop psychodrama in line with his theory of interpersonal relations. So the whole field of phenomenology was also starting to open up, because remember, this growing into psychotherapy, the shape of psychotherapy was coming out of romantic philosophy, so natural philosophies. So Freud was quite analytic in it, but you also had these more people who were not as confined in their thinking coming on stage as well. All at the same, it's interesting, all at the same time in different areas of society. So here's this guy, Ludwig Binswanger, great names, 1980 or 1881, 1996. Ludwig Binswanger. Okay, let's see if I can make that better. Okay. So this guy is a Swiss psychiatrist, and he was very much a pioneer in the field of existential psychology and phenomenology. He worked alongside Jung. He disagreed with Freud. Again, this regimental attitude of Freud. He disagreed with Freud's theory of mechanistic drives, that everything is coming from unconscious drives. And instead, he emphasized the importance of a person's world and their life experiences. He worked with Ludwig Binswanger. He worked with another guy called Edmund Bleuler, which you'll meet in a moment, and with Freud. And later on worked then with Carl Jung. So he was right in the center of it. And yet you don't really hear his name mentioned that much, this fella Binswanger. He believed that every individual is free to build the type of existence that they want. He believed that every individual is free to build the type of existence that they want. I'll just read what I have there on the slide. He was a friend of Freud and a pioneer in the field of existential psychology. Who worked alongside Jung. He disagreed with Freud's theory of mechanistic drives. He instead emphasized the importance of a person's world life experiences. He refers to a human as not merely an isolated subject, but as a subject that exists in relation to others. He refers to a human as not merely an isolated subject, but as a subject that exists in relation to others. A person's mode of relating can provide a wealth of experience about that person. He explored the intersubjective nature of the human being, and his conceptions of human experiences promoted a new way to interpret styles of existence that would otherwise have been reduced to psychopathology. So he's a very important guy within the changing times of the early century, as you begin to sort of move more towards humanistic, the emergence of the humanistic world. Okay, so we'll move on. So behaviorism. So behaviorism was officially, you could say, the second major school of psychotherapy. Psychoanalytic work, Freud's school of psychoanalytical work being the first major school, behaviorism became the second major school. And it became very, very popular during the mid-1900s. So from 1920 onwards, behaviorism was really, really big, certainly in America. So this model maintained that behaviors can be described scientifically without recourse either to internal physiological events or to hypothetical constructs, which is thoughts or beliefs. So very much what you see is what you get. The central idea in behaviorism being that all actions are acquired through conditioned processes. Behaviorism is the study of the connection between our mind and our behavior. It's the study of the connection between our mind and our behavior, and is concerned with the discovery of patterns within behaviors. It concerns itself with the discovery of patterns within our behaviors. So it's completely looking outwards. Behaviorism suggested that psychology should be the science of observable behavior. So this was behaviorism. Where did it come from? Well, it was initially born out of Pavlov's work. Now, Pavlov would have worked a lot with animals, you know, behavior of animals and, you know, birds and whatnot. But Watson, John Watson, who's an American psychologist, you know, again, born 1878, and he lived until 1958. John Watson, you could say, was the first real. He was to behaviorism that Freud was to psychoanalytical work. And then after Watson, Thorndike and Skinner became the main movers within the field of behaviorism. So Watson would be seen as the father of behavioral psychology. And in his paper, 1913, Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It, he published this paper, Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It. He stated, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specific world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one of them at random and train him to be any type of specialist, a doctor, a lawyer, an artist, a merchant, even beggar or a thief, regardless of his talents, his perchance, his tendencies, his abilities, his vocations, or his race of ancestors. Give me any infant, give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specific world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one of them at random and train him to be any type of specialist, doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, even beggar or thief, regardless of their talents, perchance, tendencies, abilities, vocations, or race of ancestors." So this was John Watson. And he became famous, I suppose, more famous than he was, with his little Albert experiment, which is fairly horrific, but however, it was of the time. His little Albert experience or experiment was where he conditioned a 9-month-old boy to fear a white rat. And he demonstrated in this experiment how emotions could become conditioned responses, how emotions can become conditioned responses. So what he basically did was he took this young kid out of an orphanage, and the baby boy called Albert was, you know, like any boy, I suppose, he was curious. He wasn't frightened of the rat. He'd pick up the white rat, play with it, put it down. And then what Watson did was every time the rat would appear on the scene, he'd get this big loud lump of metal and he'd wallop it and he'd make this loud noise. And he turned this friendly meeting of boy and rat into a scary experience. And within a very short while of doing this, baby Albert became frightened of the rat and would start to show distress every time the rat was brought out, and various other animals and things. So the fear that he created spread into other things. And it was a conditioned response. And then when they stopped doing it, after a short while, I think it was a week or so, the fear began to dissipate, and the baby was showing less signs of distress when the rat would be introduced, until John Watson decided, oh, let's do it again and see what happens. So horrific, abuse on a child. There's various different reports of what happened little Albert after all these experiments were finished. The report that I'm inclined to believe is that he died shortly afterwards, not as an old person, or he died in his early years. I won't say one with the other, but he had an unfortunate life. Anyway, the whole recording of the little Albert experiences online is on YouTube for anybody who wants to go in and have a look. There's lots about it, and it's well documented.
How did he die?
Sorry?
What did he die of? Fear.
What is the dire? Sorry, what is dire? Dire fear, deep fear.
What did Albert die of?
Oh, he died of some. I think it was some condition of his mind. Unfortunately, some brain disorder or some form of brain disease. I didn't go fully into it, to be honest. I found the whole thing just distressing. I didn't really want to explore too much. I just thought, oh my God, horrific. So I just didn't really want to go there, to be honest, but maybe I will some other time. But if you go online, you can find it out for yourself. But that was John Watson, and there's behaviorism. And, is it right or wrong? Well, it's an area, and his findings are honest and true. And, it is what it is. So moving forward, or rather maybe sideways a bit. So just as psychoanalytical approach was developing and psychodrama was developing and phenomenology was developing, equally psychiatry was also, beginning its own evolutionary journey. So in 1945, this is where the big changes were happening for psychiatry. And I put in this quote in the beginning: illnesses of the spirit are mental illnesses. So psychiatry has this want to include everything within itself. Psychiatry organized itself around the idea that mental disorders were reducible to anatomical or physiological pathology, often of an innate nature that has to run its course. So my purpose for including this was because it's a big area of regulation that was very much supported by the medical model. It grew out of more the area of science and medicine, whereas the other, psychotherapy, was growing more out of philosophy. But this would be very much more part of the ascent model of spirituality that Berman talks about, where we are attempting to control the God and become the God. So from early on in the 20th century, psychiatry moves towards labs for brain anatomy, becoming more detailed, impersonal, less human, as it loses itself in endless particulars, measurements, statistics, and findings. So you can see there, and even today you can see what it is. It organized itself around the idea that mental disorders are reducible to anatomical or physiological pathology, often of an innate nature, and often which most often run its course. So its claims, psychiatry, the claims to fame, apart from the obvious, was the production of the DSM manual in 1952. So one of its claims to fame has been the production of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, first produced in 1952. So for psychiatrists, psychotherapy was tainted as unscientific philosophy, and so could have nothing of real worth. So you can see, you're giving insight into the nature of the relationship between psychiatrists and psychotherapists. They have nothing of any real worth to offer. So this is where a guy, I want to bring in more about a guy called Eugene Bleuler. In 1924, he proposed a theory of hereditary and brain disposition in relation to biological viewpoint, in relation to psychosis and schizophrenia. Now, who's Eugene Bleuler? Eugene Bleuler, I don't think I have him on a slide. Do I? Let's see. I don't think so. Eugene Bleuler, he was the psychiatrist who worked at the Bergholtze Institute before Jung and Freud were working there, at the time when Jung and Freud were working there. So again, all part of the same group. But Eugene Bleuler's claim to fame is his work around schizophrenia and psychosis. And he introduced the term schizophrenia. So, he's very, very important in that regard. He was somebody of huge influence in Freud's work and also in Jung's work, because Jung was also a psychiatrist. And he was coming from this more scientific model. So he was introducing that vein of thinking, if you like, into Freud and Jung's work. Freud challenged Eugene Bleuler's work, saying that he challenged the work by proposing subjective causes rather than predisposition. Now, I'm not going to go too deeply into this whole area, but if you're interested in that, worthwhile investigating. There's a lot there. So going back to Binswanger, this guy, Binswanger, who was very much at the center. Binswanger was critical of alienation through psychoanalytical discourse. He was critical of the alienation through psychoanalytical discourse into causes, disorders, and biomedical cures. So the whole hardline attitude of psychiatry, again, was pushing a thin wedge into the gap between psychotherapy and psychoanalysis and psychiatry. These three areas, the humanistic schools, were beginning to emerge through phenomenology. You had the psychoanalytical school, which was very independent, I suppose, and then you had the mainstream psychiatry. So this sort of inflexibility was causing a rift. It was pushing things apart. Binswanger was critical of the alienation through psychoanalytical discourse into causes, disorders, and biomedical cures. His suggestion in regard to this, to psychosis, was more to do with the Lacanian concept of the real. And it was characterized by the loss of meaningful speech. And I think this is really interesting myself, that psychosis was characterized by the loss of meaningful speech. It was to do with language. and it was to do with the real. In other words, getting back to this ego, this split between the ego consciousness and what went before it, the real, as a unity consciousness. Now, Jung was bringing his own work around psychosis as well. So again, if you're interested in that, that was all going on at the time. Binswanger stated that his understanding of psychosis was that meaning is to be found in everything and everywhere. Meaning is to be found in everything, everywhere, even beyond verbal language. And with bodily expressions, he was against the labeling of such clients. He didn't want labels, hard and fast labels applied. He promoted symbolic representation of the client's life and world experience through whatever form. So you can see the broad-mindedness. He was not confined within limits. He was willing to look for meaning in everything, everywhere, in whatever form, inside language, outside of language, it was included, not labeled. So Jacques Lacan, just because I named him there, I'll just say Jacques Lacan lived 1901 to 1981, quite a modern day psychoanalyst. He's described as being as controversial as Freud. Now, when I go on and I listen to Lacanian stuff, it's like soup. I can't. I get a bit of it. It's very much its own field. So Jacques Lacan took Freud's work further, and I suppose created a split within the world of psychoanalysis. So you have Lacanian schools and you have Freudian schools, and we'll come back to that later on. But that was what was going on in that regard. So in terms of this slide, back to slide number 9, within the humanistic approach, there was emphasis being placed on the whole person and not just a pathology or a behavior. So you can see the thin end of the wedge is pushing this into existence. And during the late 19th century, early 20th century, alongside the Freudian school of psychology, there was also a more recent rise of the behavioral psychology, the second major school of psychology. A similar development was happening in the area of phenomenology. And that was taking place, which led in turn to the development of the third major school of psychology, humanistic. Humanistic, person-centered existential therapies, including psychodrama and group psychotherapy. So this is the third major school of psychology. How are we doing? Are you still managing to keep your head up? It's hard. It's fairly solid going, isn't it? I'll just deal with this slide and then maybe we'll take a break, because I know we're coming up on the end of the 2 hour. Okay, so these two characters, Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger, again, they're not names that you would maybe come across too easily, but they are the founders, they are the bedrock out of which various schools of humanistic psychotherapy have emerged. So Edmund Husserl, I think I have separate notes here on this. Yeah, before I get into them, the humanistic approach, that there's an emphasis placed on the whole person and not just a pathology or a behavior. If human beings exist on 5 levels of body, feelings, intellect, soul, and spirit, if human beings exist on 5 levels of body, feelings, intellect, soul, and spirit, then it is through the inter-realizing of these 5 levels that self-actualization occurs, i.e., getting in touch with our deepest truth. I'll read that again. If human beings exist on 5 levels of body, feelings, intellect, soul, and spirit, then it is through the interrealizing of these 5 levels, it is through the interrealizing of these 5 levels that self-actualization occurs. You can't skip one part of what we are, i.e., getting in touch with our deepest truth. This means that our journey is a journey of integration. This means that our journey is a journey of integration, that splits can be healed and holes filled. Each of our parts can get to know our other parts, accept the otherness of those parts, and be changed within that self-acceptance. I'll read that again. This means that our journey is a journey of integration, that splits can be healed and holes filled. Each of our parts can get to know our other parts, accept the otherness of those parts, and be changed within that self-acceptance. It's a journey of integration of body, feelings, intellect, soul, and spirit. So this is the bedrock of the humanistic model. This principle of integration, this acceptance of the otherness within ourselves, and the integration, the bringing to life, the self-actualization, the bringing to life of these differences, and the integration, the overall fruit of the integration. Okay, I think perhaps I've done enough so far.